Hey, Ty, want to buy a magazine?
Sure. I mean, I think my grocery store still has a newsstand. Is People still a thing?
No. Like, buy a magazine. Like, own the whole thing.
You can do that?
Apparently. Do you think Nintendo Power is still available?
You've got FunFactor, two old gamers reviewing old video game magazine reviews. I'm Ty Shelter, he's Aiden Moher. We're two professional writers who grew up loving the video games and video game magazines of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. Every episode, we take a critical look back on the games media that, for better and for worse, inspired us to do what we do. First, go to funfactorpod.com and follow the show on your podcatcher of choice. Leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your media. We'll read the best, kindest, funniest, and most insightful ones on the air in our letters section. Please consider becoming a member of FunFactor Ultra, our premium tiers that unlock ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and the members-only channels of our Discord. Just go to funfactorpod.com, and I promise you cannot miss the sign-up widget on our homepage. Then, help us spread the word. Shout us out on Blue Sky at funfactorpod.com, or anywhere else at FunFactorPod. So, on this very special bonus episode of Fun Factor, we're speaking with a couple of people who have put in enormous legwork to make this show possible. As much as we're proud of what we do here to preserve and discuss and contextualize legacy games media, our guests today have saved, acquired, and made available a treasure trove of games history in their endeavor to preserve the past.
It's no exaggeration to say that Video Game History Foundation founder and director Frank Cifaldi and library director Phil Salvador were numbers like 1 and 2 on our dream list of guests when we started conceptualizing this show.
Wow.
We're so happy to have them here today and to talk about a pretty important moment, I think, in games media preservation, no less. Phil, Frank, welcome.
Yeah, good to be here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Before we really get into the meat of this issue, this episode that we're doing today, I want to crack things open with a fun little exercise. You have an enormous library and collection and archives of games media and kind of games memorabilia and ephemera. What is one of the weirdest or most interesting things in your collections?
I'll go first. I once scanned a prop beard. we don't own the prop beard, but I flatbed scanned a prop beard used in the game Steel Harbinger for the PlayStation when I was on site with the producer of that game digitizing his material. He had the fake beard that I think he himself wore in the game for his bit part.
He did. He played Rocco. Yes.
There you go. Yeah, the famous character Rocco from Steel Harbinger, played by Mark Flipman, the game's producer. He just had the beard in his paper files, and I was scanning his paper files, so I went and I scanned the beard too, and now there's a scan of a beard on our digital archives.
Very useful.
I think I cataloged that one as mixed materials. I think is the official designation for that. And I'll give you a magazine, since this is a magazine show. One of the ones you probably have never come across is PS Max Magazine. It ran for one issue back in the day. It was a PlayStation magazine for children, by which they didn't have an official masthead and writers. It was like cartoon characters who would talk to you about games, and it would be like, Final Fantasy VIII is great, but it's really hard. You might have trouble with it. It was not successful. It was a spin-off of PSN that they tried, ran for one issue, and I think we have an issue of that from the editor who worked on it. Not an especially prolific magazine, but one of the odder one-off publications we have.
I want to do a magazine one really quick too. I didn't think about that. So I'm going to go with IQ. What does IQ stand for, Phil?
Interactive Quarterly.
Interactive Quarterly. Very innocent sounding name. This is a magazine very specifically about interactive adult CD-ROMs in the mid-90s. It's interactive adult material. Somehow there is no nudity in this magazine. It is a safe for work-ish magazine. And there are there's something like an attempt at criticism of these products. I'm pretty sure this magazine existed for the ad dollars and that's it. But they kind of tried, and it's really a weird artifact, and I don't know who the audience was.
If you remember that scene, The Big Lebowski, where the guy in his big mansion is talking in a very urbane voice, and he discusses that the future is interactive erotic software. It's like that. It's like the magazine is for him and no one else is kind of the audience for it. It's fascinating.
It is how we discovered Mast, a porn parody of
Oh,
Myst
boy.
that is still lost media.
Wow.
Oh boy.
The mind boggles.
It's incredible that there's no nudity in there, because one of the issues that Ty and I covered, I can't remember what magazine it is off the top of my head, but they were getting like, one of the letter mails was like, hey, did you guys forget to blur out the butt in that photo of some Sega Genesis game? And sure enough, they had to apologize for having like a pixelated butt in one of the previews for a Sega Genesis game in their magazine. It might have been Game Pro.
And when it came here from Japan, it was censored.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's some mist in front of the Sonic's butt cheeks.
20. It was like a 20 by 16 pixel blue fairy. Like what are we censoring here?
That's right.
Well, gentlemen, we invited you on the show today because the Video Game History Foundation made an exciting recent announcement. You acquired the rights to Computer Entertainer magazine?
This was founded by sisters Mary Lou Badeau and Celeste Dolan, and ran from 1982 to 1990. This newsletter, fanzine, early magazine was one of the few American publications covering the home gaming scene and game consoles during some of the industry's most historic years. In the announcement post for the acquisition, you wrote, quote, as a result, Computer Entertainer is one of the only sources for American reviews of classic games like The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, and Super Mario Bros. And because it was run by a game retailer, this magazine is one of the only reliable sources of American game release dates during this period. So, why did the foundation, Video Game History Foundation, choose to pursue Computer Entertainer specifically, and how did the deal come together?
Well, I think I'll jump in here because there's a little bit of backstory that makes this make more sense. I've been someone who studies history, video game history specifically, for a very long time now, and what I identified really early on was that magazines were the meatiest source for me. I started collecting magazines in like the very early 2000s. In fact, the foundation in a lot of ways kind of started as, my personal research library as a journalist and historian who was frustrated that such a thing didn't exist and I had to build it in my house. And it was back in maybe like 2011 or so. I'll say the website specifically. So there was a zine that ran in the 90s, early 2000s called Digital Press, which is now a store in New Jersey, a retro game store. But digitalpress.com had a magazine scans section, mostly by a scanner named Scott Stilfen, who he scanned a lot of really kind of obscure 80s stuff. And as I'm sort of building my own library and looking at what was happening in the 80s, I'm kind of relying on people who are more well versed in that stuff, like Scott. And in that magazine section, there was a category for Computer Entertainer, or perhaps the Video Game Update, its original name. I don't remember, where it was at that time. And there was exactly one issue scanned. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. What is this? Is this like a small newsletter sort of thing? There was reference elsewhere online about how long it ran. But there were no other scans other than just one lone issue from an 8-year run. So I'm looking at the scan, and something I've learned to do very early in my career is just look for a name of a person and start stalking and see where you can go. And this is not a magazine with a masthead. There's no staff role. You don't know from looking at it who made it. But this happened to be a fairly rare occurrence where there was a photo that included one of the editors with a caption with her name, and it was, Computer Entertainer editor Celeste Badeau, blah 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 blah. And I was like, okay, I got a name. I found her. She's in Australia now, and I messaged her asking if she had any left, and she's like, no, I threw them all away. But I do have my personal bound volumes. I'd be happy to send them to you. And again, this was like 2011, 2012. So we got those I got those, I should say. There wasn't a foundation yet. And I arranged to get them scanned with a book scanner, which is, kind of a two cameras pointed at pages trying to like correct the skew and stuff like that. And long story short, like we put out a like serviceable scan of her volumes on the Internet Archive, and that kind of spread around the historian community as a good resource. And in terms of like, fast forwarding to today and like why did we acquire it and rescan it and all that, this, it's not a happy story, but the story is that Mary Lou's sister, the co-editor of the magazine Celeste, who you mentioned earlier, Celeste passed this year. And Mary Lou was cleaning out her home, and she found that Celeste also had her bound volumes, the identical set. They both had a set, and she emailed me because we had just recently interviewed her for our podcast, the Video Game History Hour. So, we were still kind of fresh in her mind. She emailed me and said, "Hey, I found Celeste's books. Do you want those too?" And I said yes, but I also, I saw an opportunity there where it's like, well, we didn't properly scan the volumes because we only had one. If we have an identical set, it's not going to completely shatter my heart to cut the pages out and scan them properly. And then as I continued thinking it through, I just had the thought like, well, Mary Lou might be, the sole copyright holder of this material at this point. So I thought there might be I didn't know what the opportunity was, but I was like, maybe there's an opportunity there to make a video game magazine free. And so I asked her and we worked it out and acquired it. And I think because we own it, that gave me the excuse to not only, do the labor of making digital editions of the magazine, but also gave me an excuse to go out and travel to the one person that I know of that kept his subscription copies, Leonard Herman, who's a video game Leonard Herman, who's a video game historian. He wrote Phoenix, which is like the first video game book. He had the last, I think, 7 issues that just never made it to a bound set because that year never concluded. So we were able to not acquire, but we went and scanned the last few issues, and finally had the first intact set, had them all cleaned up, had them sorted. I had to manually edit very extensively the first 3 issues because all they had were like bad photocopies of them. And yeah, we just saw it as an opportunity to do something different, and that's what we did.
One of the things that like stands out to me is you have recently launched like a digital library, which makes available a lot of old issues of magazines. What are the benefits of owning and acquiring a magazine like this versus just having it in your collections?
Well, I think what's really exciting about it is, the things we have in our digital library we make available through fair use for research purposes. But when we own the magazine, it's not just that it makes it easier for us to share it, it's that we can then authorize other people to do things with it. When we get donations from developers about development material or things like that, we often have them sign a deed of gift that says something to the effect of like, to the extent that you have rights to this, you allow us to allow other people to reproduce this in their research. So if there's like a book that's going to be using something we have in like, we have the collection of materials from Cyan. It's all the videos from the making of the Myst series, which is really cool.
Wow.
We can allow people to use that in their documentaries, which is great. And that actually is happening right now, too. There's a documentary about the Myst series that's using footage from our library. This is a case where we can just say, hey, we have the rights to this. You can blanket do whatever you want with this. We put the whole thing into the Creative Commons for free, as long as you give attribution to VGHF. You can use this in anything you want, including commercial projects, which is already happening, which is really cool. And it was a case where, we first thought like, okay, maybe there's like a non-commercial license for research. And then it was like, you know what? This is easier. This is the right thing to do. It's like, if we just put it out for anyone to do something with, not only does that kind of selfishly make our lives easier because we don't have to manually approve requests, but it's like, no, we have the power to just let anyone use this. So why not? And, I think sometimes about, when I tell people I work for a nonprofit and they ask me like, oh, how are you monetizing things? How are you going to license your material? And it's like, we're literally a charity. This is the goal, is we want to help with, a friend of ours in academia referred to this as knowledge production. And I really like that, where it's like, our product is we give you resources you then use to generate interpretation of information and knowledge and understanding. And I think that's having the rights to something. It's not just, it's not just putting up a scan for a magazine. It's, this belongs to everyone now. You can create what you want with it. I think that's really powerful and really unique and unusual in this space, I think, to happen. Because, and you were joking earlier about buying Nintendo Power. That's not happening anytime soon. This is kind of a rare opportunity. This is one of the few magazines that was not bought up by one of the, big four or whatever remaining giant publishing companies.
And I just want to add to that a little. This might be, I don't know if this is too inside baseball to talk about like running a small business, because
no such thing.
Even though it's a charity, it is a business, right? Like I have to pay us, right? Like we have to be able to eat. And what Phil was saying about, well, how are you going to monetize this? How are you going to make money off this? Something that I've learned, I've never had to run a business before. This is my first one. And something that I've learned over the years is that if you spend a lot of time and resources generating revenue on things that are fairly low yield, like if we charge for access for Computer Entertainer, and like I don't know, we're gonna make like $2,000 or something. You know what I mean? Like you just have to learn to do the math and be like, this isn't worth it versus like the goodwill that comes out of just putting it out.
I was gonna say there's definitely a evil like Embracer Group version of this where you walk into your friend Norman's house and go, yeah, these 7 issues are technically mine now. Get a lawyer about it.
When you go to the Ferengi archives, I wonder what their preservation system is like on Ferenginar. But I think it is also, in addition to what Frank said, it aligns with our values. I mean, I think, it is a case where it's like, what we want to do is we want to make video game history better as a field. We like to say that the library is a tool that makes people better video game historians. And like, what better way to contribute to that than to create something that is now free information, free knowledge that's out there. So,
I don't talk about this very much, but my day job is actually with a museum, a large museum. And I work in digital, and like personally for me, like a core tenet of what I want to do is using digital tools to make history accessible for people, because museums have existed for a long time, but often you've had to go to them. You've had to come to the museum to access archives and collections, and we do a lot of work making sure that that's no longer the case. And I think that there's a lot of tension right now about, like I'm sure you guys deal with it, but like AI crawlers coming into like collections and archives websites and databases, using up resources and finding that path forward of saying, we have these materials, we want to make them accessible, we don't want them to be used in bad faith by people who are going to try to make money off of them in whatever way. And I think that your approach of saying, hey, let's put this in the Creative Commons because then everyone can use it, and that tension sort of goes away in a way that I think draws just a lot of positive attention to the work that you're doing and the work that the people on this magazine and old magazines like that do.
And just to add to that, we can't do that with everything, of course. I mentioned the Cyan stuff. That's owned by Cyan. They gave us permission to share, but we don't own it. So this is a case where it's like, hey, we can do this. Yeah. So let's do it.
And I will say, I guess this is just the frame of mind I'm in. Is I'm interested in discussing how we survive as a business. That like I can imagine a scenario, a donation of copyright or something where we don't open it up to the Creative Commons, and it's not that we wouldn't allow access to it and fair use for research, etc. But for example, if we had like footage that like documentarians would maybe want to license for their documentaries, we might have a different license in that case because it might actually be a revenue opportunity. But I don't think that Computer Entertainer is, to be frank. Like I just don't think that that the nickel and diming stuff like this is worth it versus something where it's like, oh, maybe a well-funded movie might make sense to actually pay us for our labor.
You thought we were talking about magazines in this podcast. Joke's on you, we're talking about nonprofit fundraising. Gotcha.
Well,
I've spent a lot of time working in the nonprofit space.
Yeah. My wife's day job is in the nonprofit sphere, and we've both done. We're both in political organizing. I'm the partnerships chair for Rank My Vote, which is the ranked choice voting ballot initiative here in Michigan. We're going to amend the Constitution, gathering signatures in the field right now. So like this is all the time for me. Totally comfortable with
it. Games media, like especially through the 90s when computer entertainer was predominantly, I guess.
No, it ended in 90.
Ended in 90, but still.
That's crazy. Yeah, that is what makes it interesting, is it was so early. There's like a reputation for games media to be dominated by young men, especially back sort of in the 80s and 90s. So it was especially interesting when you made this announcement. I wasn't familiar with computer entertainer because I was like 4 when it was being published.
Well, and also I'm pretty sure it had a very low circulation. I mean, it wasn't a newsstand magazine. It was mail order only. You know, it was an extension of a mail order company. And the only people that I've ever known that even knew about it have had some affiliation with the industry. Right. And, you know, they would, I mean, we actually have, just by coincidence, we recently acquired something that demonstrated to us that they were exhibiting at Consumer Electronics Show in '85 and like handing out a free issue, you know, to get people to sign up. So it's something where it's just very low print run and is sort of a like, you know, for people in the know kind of thing and not a typical newsstand magazine.
Right. Sort of that's, it's almost like Worldcon is on right now. It's a big science fiction fantasy convention that used to be very like sort of like niche, like the like, you know, kind of core group of writers and fans were there, but now it's expanded into something much larger. One thing that stood out to me about Computer Entertainer was that it was founded by 2 women. You've talked a lot about Mary Lou and her sister Celeste, but what do you think that their legacy means for games media as like a diverse space nowadays?
I think what's really exciting about it, and this is kind of counterintuitive, is that it's not super exceptional or exciting. You know, I think if we look back at, again, it is the space of games media does have that very, you know, like male skewing angle, especially once the industry revved back up when the NES came in. But I think what's really notable is that even though this was run by 2 women, it wasn't pigeonholed as like a publication by or for women. Like if you look at a lot of those magazines or publications or communities, they'll often have like, you know, the women writer. It's like she's not like other girls or something like that. It's like, no, they just were 2 of the most prolific video game journalists of the era, and they were women. I think it's notable because when we look back at a lot of you know, some sort of the early diversity in the video game industry, we often look for, you know, the sort of like essentialist, like, oh, what are they doing that's unique to their, you know, their particular gender or race? Like, you know, I think about, this is going a bit further afield, but I think this we're talking about, you know, an example like Muriel Tramis, who made games in France about, you know, her about the French Caribbean and the history there, and they're very much about race and gender in ways that are palpable and exciting. And I think and Muriel Tramis is a really important milestone in, you know, Black game development. But I also think about, we just got a collection in that touches on Stan Thomas, which is someone who I think people don't know. He was the president of Sega Channel. And he was a Black game executive, and that had, you know, his work did not have anything to do with his identity. He was just the president of Sega Channel, but he is also a really important Black pioneer in video games. Yeah. So when we talk about Mary Lou and Celeste, I think it's exciting that they were here this early in the industry. They were again very prolific journalists, but it wasn't like, here's the women journalists. You know, I put him in conversation with someone like Joyce Worley, who was one of the first women game journalists, where they just were good at their jobs and effective and were women. And I think that's exceptionally notable considering how hard the pendulum swung back the other way once we got the, you know, oh, hey, we can sell video games to young boys who want to blow things up, once the industry started kicking back in the United States.
Yeah, that's kind of what came to mind for me, too, is that there was a pendulum swing. And if we're talking about the early 80s where Computer Entertainer, I should say the video game update, spawned out of, it does look to me to be slightly more gender diverse than it became in the 90s. You know, Phil mentioned Joyce Worley, who was, you know, one of the 3 main editors at Electronic Games, the first sort of newsstand glossy console video game magazine. You know, that's 1/3 of the editorial staff was female. I think about things like the early programmers at like Atari and Activision and even like Mattel Electronics for the Intellivision. If you go through and look at the staff, it's it can be surprising how many games were just straight up written by women. And I don't know if something quote unquote happened, but I do know that that wasn't necessarily the case, kind of starting in the 90s but yeah, to Phil's point, I think what's interesting is that it's kind of not interesting.
Yeah, when you see like the blooper videos and the credits of the Tony Hawk games, and it's like all the like guys in their 20s skateboarding through walls of Mountain Dew or whatever they do in the offices at Neversoft at 2 a.m. while they're all crunching. It's like that's not the natural state of video games. Like, no, there had been a diverse, especially in media, like there have been a lot more around that. So it's great to have another example of that. It's like, no, women have always been part of the video game industry. There's always been diversity. It's not something that we're like, I don't even want to entertain arguments about like forced diversity or whatever, but it's like, no, it's always been there. What are you talking about?
That's something we've actually been finding too, even looking at we're starting with 1995 through 1997, sort of the transition from 16 to 32-bit. And like the very first issue of Game Players we looked at, which was like peak juvenilia, right? For guys. And, pen pal section, half the names are, what would be considered girls' names, right? Like you see there's like the next issue we saw this like Blockbuster World Championship, and it's like, it was like 30% girls and pretty ethnically diverse also. And, and it's like, it's the forced non-diversity. The non-diversity is the forcedness, right? Like that's where like people doing this false history of how things always were later down the road, or say, hey, no, this is a boys' club, stay out. I think that we're finding that again and again.
They invented gender to sell video games. It's really...
All right, well, it's time for a break. Guys, when we come back, we are going to look at some reader mail. Welcome back to FunFactor, where two old gamers review old video game magazine reviews. Of course, we want you to review us. Do we get a full 5.0 in FunFactor? Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll read the best, funniest, kindest, and most entertaining ones on the air.
You should ask people to review you using the review scale they use for Computer Entertainer, where it's 2 4-star. I assume we're going to talk about this.
Yes.
Well, yes, we're going to get into this.
They've got a unique scale, yeah.
It's fantastic. Ty, I tricked you.
Oh.
Usually, this is the part where we have our guests read some letter mail.
Oops.
But instead, I want to do a little something different this time, and it touches on something that Frank was just bringing up. This episode has been very much about inside baseball. So this is going to be a little inside baseball look behind the curtain at how sausage is made for Computer Entertainer. And on page 13 of Volume 5, Number 3, which is a June 1986 edition, the editors give a little rundown of how they make the magazine and some of the recent technological improvements they'd had to their process. I'm going to read a little taste of what that looked like in 1986. So, quote, "Up until this month, this part of the operation was done manually and then put down on artboards before heading to the printer, normally requiring 1 to 1.5 days." This was laying out page designs. "This month, we have initiated the use of PageMaker, a desktop publishing tool designed by Aldous. This program has given us even more flexibility and a few more precious hours before going to print than we've had in the past, as well as giving the newsletter a much cleaner look. Once the newsletter is laid out the way we want it, we print the master pages on our Apple laser writer, which we've been using for about 5 months. Those master pages head to the printer at 8 a.m., It's printed by 3 p.m. and in the hands of our mailing service by 4 p.m. The stamped, stuffed envelopes which arrive at your door are dropped off at the post office by 8 p.m. the same day, allowing us to insert late-breaking stories as late as 1 hour before going to the printer." I've been making content for a long time, but not that long. But I thought it was really fun to see how much effort was put into a zine like this, and how tools were constantly evolving in the 80s to allow a small production team like this to create something that was reaching, not a large number of people, but people who were dedicated readers, like even back in the mid 90s. It's pretty neat. It's it seems archaic now, but even them, like back then, they were like, counting hours or counting minutes, the same way we do in sort of this digital age, which I thought was interesting.
Oh, and yeah, I mean, that's not super unique. I mean, if you talk to the guys who were doing EGM in the 80s and 90s, they were very much cutthroat about, being first to press, and they had a lot of sort of late night deliveries to the printer and stuff like that. And seems primarily to try to beat GamePro to market was their whole thing. But they would do things like, some issues would have supplements in the polybag with them, and that's because it was like, between Consumer Electronics Show and our print deadline, we have like 3 days. So instead of trying to get it in the magazine, we're gonna have the magazines already done, and we're gonna print like a second quick magazine so that we're the first people to tell everyone about what games are coming out. And yeah, it's that publishers were absolutely aware of the ship dates of their competitors and did try to work around that. I don't know if that's relevant here. I don't think that Computer Entertainer saw anything as a competitor necessarily. They were doing something unique, but yeah, it is kind of fun to realize that it wasn't just sitting back in your chair and publishing when you felt like it. Like there still was timeliness to these things.
I love the idea that somewhere in the summer of 1995, however many hundred thousand Computer Entertainer subscribers would have found out that the Sega Saturn was available for launch like 2.5 months before any of the other magazines made it to the newsstands.
I do think that's really interesting that, as game magazines became larger and more established, I mean, I'm sure you've talked about it in the podcast, but, we look at like, okay, what's covering what each month. It's like the publication month listed on a magazine is usually the month after it was actually released, and the content usually predates it by 3 months because they have lead time, and like that's as press started getting more heavily established. Versus this, it's like, yeah, they are literally like, here's what we're doing hour by hour getting this out. I think it's easy to kind of mythologize or even infantilize a lot of this early history as being like, oh, they were flying by the seat of their pants. There's no rules. But no, it was two sisters just like making this stuff, sending to the printer, physically picking it up a little bit later. When they mentioned the hands of our mailing service stamped envelopes, I think on the podcast, Frank, I think Mary Lou said they originally just had like a kid in the neighborhood stuffing envelopes. Which that's a big contrast from, these sort of like manufactured polybags, things being inserted. Like, no, this was the era of, games being distributed on floppy disks and Ziploc bags. So it is cool to have that firsthand look at like, hey, we're using desktop publishing now. I will say that's around the time that the font in Computer Entertainer becomes briefly unreadable, which is unfortunate. There's a period where they're fairly low resolution Macintosh printouts. So there's like a year or two where it's our OCR software really worked overtime on those ones. But
let's take a look at this issue on the episodes of the show, the mainline episodes. Of course, we do flip throughs of the magazines, and then we review, and we're going to do the same thing here today. We're going to look at Computer Entertainer, Volume 5, Number 3, and then we'll review the first review of Super Mario Brothers with you two today. Ty, can you kick us off by painting a word picture of Computer Entertainer in 1996? What are we looking at for people listening to the audio version of the podcast?
Yeah, well, if you take what we talked about just a second ago, the word newsletter and Macintosh fonts and maybe the Star Trek The Next Generation font, the title case font saying Computer Entertainer, that's gets you about 80% of the way there. Just pretty simple header, 2-column layout. It honestly looks exactly like a blog from circa 1994 through 2004, but on paper in black and white.
That is the Star Trek font.
It absolutely is, yeah.
Wild.
Oh, yeah.
So is this the era of the software we were just talking about? Because this font seems fine to me.
Yeah, this font, that issue looks good.
Yeah, it does.
Nice and clean.
Sorry,
Yeah.
the font is fine. I actually was literally still loading. But I just meant it's a typeset. You know, it's the fonts you have on your computer. You know, it's a good computer's fonts. This
issue is fine. I think the unreadability may have been earlier. Maybe they switched off whatever that was and moved to PageMaker. Maybe they were using like simple text or whatever they were in their Macintosh. And,
there was there's a brief time where the text is very aliased. Right. But this is kind of where they settle whatever this is, and this is
really
extremely readable.
Really clean. Yeah. For $3 you get a very dense, text-heavy zine.
Yeah.
There's some small screenshots, but unlike a lot of the magazines that we would start seeing in like the 90s, which were very like layout focused, very screenshot heavy, we're looking at, you know, like there might be a screenshot here and there. It looks like it's probably a photograph of CRT rather than any direct feed.
I mean, we'll get to it when we get to them, but
I want to do a whole episode with Frank about. Yeah, I'd love to do a whole episode with you, Frank, just about capturing footage of old CRT games. But it's very, very dense and text heavy, which is even more impressive to me for such a small team. How often were these monthly, bi-monthly?
They're monthly.
Monthly. It's a lot of work. And it covers a pretty wide gamut. They have CES and Apple rumors, the GBA Championship Basketball 2-on-2 review for the Commodore 64, which I assume is not a Game Boy Advance at that time. You could win a cruise to the Mississippi, which is pretty cool.
Oh, is that based on Murder on the Mississippi, the game?
It is based on Murder
in connection with the release.
So you could get murdered.
You could possibly get murdered.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, there it is. In connection with the release of Murder on the Mississippi, Activision sponsoring drawings for cruises on the Mississippi Queen. Okay. All right.
On page 7, we are going to skip forward to a fun little preview of a piece of tech that I thought was interesting. There's a little cutout or a little section called the End of Frustration. And it's a little capsule preview of a device called the Infinity Engine, which was basically a game genie for the Commodore 64. I'm going to read like a truncated version of what they've written here. Quote, "If you're a typical action game player, you have more than a few pieces of software lying around which you've never quite managed to conquer. Perhaps you've been stymied on the 11th screen of Bounty Bob Strikes Back, a common occurrence for us all, I'm sure, or stopped by the 32nd screen of Jumpman. After long hours of frustration, sweaty palms, and joystick-cramped fingers, you gave up hope of ever making it to the next screen. You don't have to be frustrated any longer, fellow gamer, because Mastertronic has come to the rescue. They have just released the Infinity Engine, a truly eccentric cartridge for your Commodore 64 or 128. The cartridge works in conjunction with your game on disk, allowing you to turn off your game's ability to detect sprite collisions on a selective basis. So this was a device that sat between your console and the game disc, I suppose.
No, it would go in the cartridge slot, and that's why they specify, because games could come on cartridge or disc. So I suspect that they are specifying disc here because the cart slot is taken by this.
Because the cart slot is taken. That makes more sense. I was trying to picture how this would work. But they go on to kind of pump up how this is a switchable effect, so you could turn it on and off when you needed it, just to get past a hard level. And what I think is interesting is, it's kind of pay to win the old-fashioned way. We have that now with microtransactions. There's always money in the banana stand if the banana stand is cheating at single-player games. But I just also thought it was interesting that you could have a device that would turn off sprite collision in every game.
I'm sure just like Game Genie, it worked every time and was perfectly reliable.
Yes,
had exactly the effects you attended and none of the ones that you didn't.
Totally. But I can't even picture how, from like a development perspective, that would work, because all of that would be theoretically handled differently in every game. And now I really want to get my hands on one of these.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that it's something inherent to the way a Commodore 64 works, that most of the time people do sprite collision by doing this specific thing. So
that's like built into the Commodore.
Some call, some function. That's
But one of the things I think is interesting is this doesn't really read as, like, this reads almost as an advertisement. It's a preview. It's kind of, I don't know if they had any ability to make money off of this, maybe you're buying it from an ad in the back.
Well, hang on. There's no ads in the back, but I think you're missing the context that, yes, you're right. This was a mail order video game company.
Yeah.
So they sold a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And
I
don't know if they sold this specifically, but you're saying it sounds like an ad, and that is because they are doing the very typical thing that other news sources from this era was doing too, and even today is they got a press release. It was mailed to them. They summarized the press release.
Yeah. Which again, like, the old ways kind of have never gone out of fashion, right? And that's something as a games writer I'm inundated with is press releases that people want me to kind of, get in there and just regurgitate. But I liked that there was a lot of character in this writing. Mm-hmm. There's more personality. It didn't feel like a press release that was just regurgitated. And I think that voice kind of comes through in a lot of the issue of Computer Entertainer, which stood out to me and was fun.
Yeah, I think this is not something they necessarily wore on their sleeves, but they were an independent publication, and that did inform what they wrote about. Someone tipped us off to a very funny series of articles in a later issue where they talk about how they realized you can go to Japan and buy Famicom games, and those are effectively the same as NES games. And hey, we're going to see if we can get these to work on our NES. Maybe you can modify them. And in the following issue, they had received a correction from Nintendo saying, no, this violates the law, don't do this. Which, on the one hand, Nintendo is always going to be Nintendo, but also I think it is interesting that it's like, no, they could cover that stuff. They were selling things to their readers, and part of it was like, hey, you can get games from over there too, maybe, and let's figure this out. I mean, again, that wasn't like core to the identity of who they were, but they were responsive to their readers. They were writing stuff to sell people products. So yeah, I think it is a different perspective than... I'm trying to think of what, even in that space, what other magazines were there at the time, because as I think we have talked about a little bit or we will talk about more, there weren't other console game magazines. This wasn't affiliated with a particular publisher. This wasn't, it was kind of in a weird space, but it gave them the flexibility to write about, here's a cool thing you can get, which results in articles like this.
Yeah, which I think is fun. And like, as they wrap up in this little preview or ad or review or whatever you want to call it, they say like, you'll finally make it to the next screen. Of course it's cheating, but who cares? Think of how envious your game-playing friends will be when you describe the final screen in excruciating detail. There is a drawback, though. The fame will be short-lived when your friends discover the Infinity Machine, too. What price? Infinite gameplay? A mere $24.95. And I love the idea that, like, if you're a reader of Computer Entertainer, they're not just trying to kind of like sell you a product, but sell you like this idea or this experience where you're going to be the first one. Like, will your friends catch up? Oh, totally, because they're going to find out about this eventually, but you want to get there first.
We also don't know that they sold this. They might
like who knows? Because this is like, again, this is a really dense magazine, and so I think that they were probably checking out stuff that was coming across their desk.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, we don't have... So Video Takeout is the mail order company, and we don't have... I mean, we have literally one example of a Video Takeout catalog, and it's from like 1990, I think, is the one that we have. So, we don't know month to month what it is they were selling, other than what they might advertise in the back of the issue, like this one.
Yeah,
actually.
Like they do. So if you look at page 15, there is a subscriber buying service. Yeah. And it has Murder on the Mississippi.
Yeah, they got Nintendo Deluxe System with robot and gun.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, if we're jumping ahead to this page, like I was just looking at it, and there's a few interesting things. So first of all, the NES isn't out nationally yet. It had just been tested in New York. And it is just starting to roll out in its second test market in LA, which is where they are. So they're selling this earlier than it is available nationwide. I do find that interesting also from the perspective of, I don't know if they were allowed to, because I know for a fact that part of the agreements with retailers in the New York area during the 85 launch is that even if they did mail order, they couldn't do mail order for Nintendo product.
Oh, interesting.
Oops.
because there's a bunch of that in here.
But that was New York. I don't know
Yeah.
about this sort of test market. The second one. Another interesting thing. So Nintendo Deluxe system with robot and gun. So that came with Gyromite and Duck Hunt. And then right under it is Control Deck.
Yeah.
Which is just the system, I think, at that
Yes.
point. But they're also separately selling Duck Hunt and Gyromite, the two games that came with the deluxe system. So
they're
you can get the
breaking
deluxe
some down,
system,
maybe. Yeah.
or you can get it, or you can buy everything separately, right? 'Cause, which makes sense, I guess. Maybe you're like, I don't like the robot, but I like the gun.
Also,
I
I
gotta
noticed
say,
in
too-
here there's Rings of Zilfin for $28.80, which caught my eye on page 9 because the subhead, another look at Rings of Zilfin. If you go, okay, cool, what is this about? We were asked by Strategic Simulations Inc. to take another look at Rings of Zilfin, an animated blah 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 blah. We rated the game average for graphics and fair for gameplay. Again, we'll get into their scoring in a second, but Strategic Simulations registered a mild protest on the and so they had their reviewer re-review by setting the difficulty lower and getting deeper into the game, and they go through this whole thing, and then our reviewer said, yeah, like maybe I'd give it half a more point to go from fair to average on gameplay, but I still don't think there's anything outstanding here or interesting, so they effectively stand by their review. And again, here's the flip side of where they're acting as journalists and critics, going, hey, we got a direct message from a publisher like complaining about our score and asking us to re-review it, and we did, and we stand by it. Like that's really fascinating too. And then they're still selling the game at the back along with Murder on the Mississippi, that they have a promo going. They're promoting the contest with the publisher. Just lots of it's a really cool and interesting blend of hats that they're wearing here.
And they didn't have to worry about SSI pulling their ads for Kane and Lynch
True.
Dead Men or whatever it happens to be. Yeah, so it's but again, that's not something they weren't like pulling like a Dave Halverson or Red being like, we're the only independent publication, we're the only ones who can be trusted. But they had editorial integrity, even though they were also selling you products. I think that's neat.
Yeah, I think that's neat too. I also want to point out a Nintendo NES Control Deck, $77 before launch. It's like $225 now. That's pretty cheap. Game consoles are expensive. Let's get into the meat of things as we talk about this review of the classic, what was it called? Rings of Zilfin.
Yes.
Let's look at Computer Entertainer's review of Super Mario Brothers. But before we really get into the
Super
review
what?
itself, Super Mario Brothers. It's a
Oh.
game based on a movie.
That's
with
weird.
Dennis Hopper. Before we get into the meat of the review, can one of you kind of give an explainer about the relevance of this review specifically, but also, Phil, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but the relevance of Computer Entertainer at this time in games media and what else was going on in that space at this time?
You want to cover that, Phil?
Yeah, so in terms of what else was happening in games media, there kind of wasn't. There were other publications covering video games in the United States, but I should say video games we use that term interchangeably now for everything. At the time, they were seen as these sort of distinct audiences and groups. So there was home console games, there were computer games, there were arcade games. And at this time, following the 83-84 US console market crash, the console game magazines ended. There had been a large number of magazines covering those topics, and those all, for the most part, got discontinued. Even some arcade magazines did as well, as the whole, electronic games sector started to take a tumble in the US. So there were still some publications. There was Computer Gaming World was the big one that was still running during this period that covered computer games and very occasionally would dip into covering relevant console titles, but mostly they were the ones covering the submarine simulators and those kind of things that were coming out for computers at the time. There were arcade publications like trade magazines like Replay Magazine and Playmeter, and there were some other things that sprouted up around this time, like a precursor to EGM, Top Score, which also covered arcade games. But in terms of
Only covered arcade games, actually.
only covered arcade games.
Yeah.
Okay, I think they may have, if I remember right, they may have dipped their toes into once or twice later on in their run doing something with console coverage. But they were arcade also. But in terms of every month we're covering what's happening on consoles, this was kind of the only game in town in the US. So in terms of English language reviews of Mario Brothers that were contemporary, there's, once this came out in the UK, there were some UK reviews. Once the Versus Mario Brothers arcade game came out, there were a couple of those reviews in the arcade publications as well. But in terms of we're covering console games coming out, this was the only magazine in town, and as a result, they were, we think, the first people to cover Mario Brothers. I think also really important is that this is not a super exceptional, notable, like, stop all presses, it's time for the Mario review. This is on page 12 of this magazine. They had games they came out with at launch, and obviously the big highlight, it was like, oh, look, it's Rob. Oh my god, I hate the zapper. You can shoot the ducks. This was another game in the launch lineup. It's taking second billing to soccer on this page. And so I think that's notable that this was not an established property. This is not a review that's, whenever Nintendo puts out a new Mario game, now there's always a lot of like waxing about like the state of Nintendo and what this means for the company and blah, blah, blah. And, does the Chris Prattization of Mario change their economic This is just like, hey, check out this Mario game. And I think that's a really unique perspective that when we go back to, these sort of landmark titles, we expect there to be landmark reviews. This really is just a review of a good game.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. So again, the NES test marketed in New York starting late October of the previous year. They're probably looking at this game around like April, May of '86, something like that, as it's coming to LA. So in New York, Super Mario Brothers was available day one. It was one of the 15 additional games one could purchase for the NES, but Nintendo put nothing behind it. They didn't advertise that game in particular. Even when you watch, the television commercial that was produced for the test market, it's not mentioned or anything like that. This wasn't like, the landmark, important game in the set. Like, they were much, much more focused on the accessories, Gyromite, playing on the Rob, and Duck Hunt playing on the Zapper. And then past that, when they were talking about standalone games that just use the controller, they would focus kind of first on Excitebike, because they were kind of like how Rob and Gyromite were like, these aren't really games, they use new tech, right? Gyromite was being pushed very heavily as maybe the future of video games, because video games are dead, are games that you can program yourself. You can lay out your own levels. And that was kind of the push for Gyromite. And then past that, actually their biggest seller during the test market launch was Kung Fu. And I think that's because Kung Fu Master was a fairly popular arcade game. That was like the only arcade game they were offering, other than, the ones that they themselves had put out, like Duck Hunt. And so Super Mario was just not a focus for them. But we know that their marketing agency, sort of post-morteming that NES launch in New York, very specifically recommends that Super Mario Brothers be a focus in '86. That it is the sleeper hit of New York that's getting around by word of mouth. So even when Computer Entertainer's reviewing the game, I don't know that it's something that Nintendo's focusing on necessarily. And I think it's to their credit that they give it some really, really glowing words in this last paragraph here.
Yeah, let's dig into the review. But before that, I just want to explain what Computer Entertainer's reviews looked like at the time. They were sort of comfortably in the middle ground between full-on reviews, like feature reviews like we'd see in like mid or late 90s gaming magazines, and capsule reviews. Page 12, we kick things off, as Phil was saying, not with Super Mario Brothers, but with Soccer for the NES. It looks like Soccer got a 4 out of 3 diamonds. That's what it looks like. It's 4 diamonds and then a slash and then 3. But if you dig into, on page 2, the rating system, they break it down this way. 4 simple symbols equals excellent, 3 symbols is good, 2 is fair, and 1 is poor. For entertainment programs, which is what they define video games as, diamonds, the first set of diamonds is quality of graphics, and the second set of diamonds is quality of gameplay and entertainment value. So Soccer got 4 out of 4 for graphics and 3 out of 4 for gameplay, essentially. Notably too, the NES soccer review is a bit longer than Super Mario Brothers, which is relegated to that number 2 spot, like Phil said. It kicks
but
things
like
off.
half of the review is dedicated to how they don't like the NES controller and the D-pad too small.
Yeah, which is fairly typical, I think, of a lot of early reviews. Was kind of digging into some weird, like, subjective nitpicks, which is fine, but you know, 2 buttons does make certain genres a little harder.
Oh, so, not to get off track, but I'm just
No.
going through the soccer review, and it's fascinating. One of their big complaints is, it says, our in-house sports gamer is left-handed, and this pad is particularly tough because of that. And I think that is something you don't hear a whole lot about when people look back. At this point, the NES controller is just kind of like a symbol. But it's really interesting to see, like, here's this new controller. We don't like it. It's frustrating. Why can't someone... They don't say this explicitly, but as I was saying that, I just thought about, like, the Intellivision controller. And it's like, I guess that is a more left-handed friendly controller than the NES's is.
Well, think about... I was just thinking about this playing an Atari 2600. I just came back from Long Island Retro. You hold it in your left hand and you move the joystick with your right and hit the button with your left. And that's something that I forget, you know, is that we were taught to hold a home joystick in your right hand. So this was, I mean, it's another way that this is an interesting artifact, right? Is like if we're reading only the sort of glossy magazines to get historical context, you're warping in time from 84 to 89. When people have already gotten used to like this transition, but like we're seeing a rare glimpse into a cultural transition among people who were still playing games throughout this time.
It's like that infamous review of Alien Resurrection where it's like, oh my god, you use 2 sticks to move around in first person? It's like that for the NES is kind of the review of soccer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that even the Super Mario Brothers review kind of touches on some things. We'll get to that, actually. The review for Super Mario Brothers kicks off with a 3.5 stars out of 4 for graphics and 4 out of 4 perfect score for gameplay, which I think has aged well. It also
had better graphics.
Soccer had better graphics. It is isometric, I guess, which is hard. But there's a short paragraph sort of detailing the game's story, which is obviously important, about Koopa kidnapping Princess.
Why is that obviously important?
Because it's not important.
Okay. Yeah, it's just a summary of the manual, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then we get into like a fairly meaty review of Mario from a time, as you were saying, when we didn't have the language or the baggage or the weight of what Mario sort of was or should be at the time. Ty, can you read the meat of this review for me?
For sure. Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo Entertainment System features the familiar Mario character in a whole new adventure so loaded with surprises and discoveries that it could take months to experience them all. Mario's quest to save the princess is long and arduous, for him. For the game player, it's sheer delight, likely accompanied by a worn-out finger or two. We had the feeling we had barely touched the surface of this game after playing for hours, because each trip through the same region seemed to reveal new secrets of the game. Mario walks, runs, swims, and jumps his way through various worlds of the Mushroom Kingdom, avoiding the Koopa Troopa and other nasty creatures. There are countless ways that he can discover mushrooms that were made invisible by Koopa turtles, and running into them can be a rewarding experience. These formerly invisible mushrooms can turn him into Super Mario, Fiery Mario, or Invincible Mario, at least until he bumps into a bad guy again. There are coins to collect too, a whole shower of them in one spot we found. They're good for points, and 100 of them earns you an extra Mario. Truly addictive. Super Mario Bros. Belongs in that special Hall of Fame reserved for truly addictive action games, the kind that keep you from being on time for supper. Supper! Being on time for supper! The graphics are cute and comical, the music lively, but it's the great depth of play action that keeps you playing again and again. No owner of the Nintendo Entertainment System should be without this game. It's a must. Recommended.
You skipped over the part where they mentioned that it has a pause feature. Which actually was maybe a big deal. Yeah,
that's in a few of the others as well. So it does in brackets. I did cut this from the script, but it says solo or 2-player alternating, semicolon, pause. So it does have a pause feature. I think this is a pretty good review, especially given the context. They recognize what Super Mario Brothers does really well. They called out the music, which I think is fabulous. and they knew that it was something special. When, like Frank, you were saying, people weren't really understanding or recognizing or seeing that. It wasn't inevitable.
I do think that by this time, VS Super Mario Brothers was in the arcades, which is, the same game, but in an arcade cabinet. So I think it was starting to catch on.
Right.
But it's not like Nintendo was sending them an elaborate press kit and saying this is the game.
No.
Like there is some sense here that they kind of discovered this on their own.
Yes.
I'll also point out that it does a good job of illustrating what I feel is forgotten about what made Super Mario Brothers unique at the time, which is that it's a game about secrets. It's a game about exploring outside of the bounds of what you think of a video game. It's a game about, like, finding a way up to the HUD, right? Or like under the screen, or like climbing a vine and realizing there's a whole world up there, right? Like that felt unique at the time. Yeah. And I think this review, one of our only reviews, illustrates that very well.
Yeah, I think it's, especially going back now, it's hard to think of a lot of what Super Mario Brothers did as innovation. But when we got to the part where I mentioned the mushrooms that were made invisible by the Koopa Turtles, I think that's super interesting, because I was thinking about this in the context of going to Super Nintendo World at Universal earlier this year when I was down for Summer Game Fest in LA, and it was fascinating because, there were the, like question blocks you can hit and then make coin sounds or things pop up on screens, and watching, little kids running around just hitting those and like intuitively getting, you hit the block and a thing comes out. Like, that was a new idea someone had to come up with at some point. Yeah. And it is interesting to see them not coming to terms with it like it's this great ordeal, but the fact that it's like these formerly invisible mushrooms, as opposed to you hit a box and a thing comes out, which is now like just so much part of the vocabulary of video games. We look at a lot of earlier landmark titles. Like, in our collection, we have a copy of what we think is like the first edition of Rogue, the game that started the roguelike genre. And it's really interesting to see on the back where it's like, this is a unique game where every time you lose, the game starts over and it gets generated again. Have to explain what that concept means. Versus today, when you say, it's a cozy crafting roguelike farm sim, it's like, that you can roll your eyes into the back of your head, but you also know exactly what that means. Maybe that was a lot of adjectives I put in there at once, but
but Rogue can't just be like, I'm a me, like, yeah.
So exactly. So it's not like, it's Mario Brothers and you hit the question blocks like in Mario, like, that's not a thing that exists. You can't really say that. So it is neat to see them trying to figure out how to explain that in a world where, before this, games were more like Circus Charlie, right? Like, and then what is Mario Brothers? Oh, this is kind of a big deal. You can, I think, Frank, you've mentioned before, not in this review, but the idea of like, you can go down a pipe and there's a new area was like kind of a big deal at the time. And it's cool to see them wrapping themselves around that and appreciating
so much. Like, about video games up until that point was, video games were about what was on the screen in front of you. It wasn't about what was under the screen or above the screen. Or notably also, it's not touched on in this review, but like Mario's scrolling levels instead of screen-based levels was pretty revolutionary on game consoles. And
I want to go.
Okay, go for it.
Something that they say that touches on my own memories of playing Super Mario Brothers for the first time is I'm trying to find it, but it's something like it's a long journey for him, right?
Yes.
Yes. And what struck me when I played it for the first time is, I don't remember, what level 3 or 4 or whatever, but you've been playing in the daytime, and then suddenly, just a simple trick, they change the palette background color of the sky from blue to black, and it's nighttime now. Mm-hmm. And as a kid playing this, that had the immediate effect of, this guy's on a very long journey. Like, time is progressing as I go forward in this game. This feels very large. I think it's there's a lot of positive things you can say here about the design of Super Mario Brothers, but also the intuition of these sisters. I would suspect this is a Mary Lou review. She was more of the quote unquote fantasy player than the sports player. That they kind of understood, like, this is new. This is unique. This is worth spending time on.
I want to actually bring this all back to the Infinity Machine article we were talking about earlier, because when you were mentioning about the idea of scrolling, I remember this line from it where it said, "Perhaps you've been stymied by the 11th screen of Bounty Bob Strikes Back." And in the context of having Mario in the same article, that just feels like, like an issue of Billboard covering MTV that also has an article about radio, where it's like, it's this transitional moment where it's like, I think that's what's really unique about Computer Entertainer as a publication that was covering everything in the electronic game space except arcade machines, really. Everything in the home electronic game space, let's say, was that they had a broad view of this stuff. And so on the one hand, there are still Commodore 64 games where, things are broken into screens. I don't know the last time someone's referred to screens as levels.
Right, yeah.
Or vice versa. But it is really neat to see that, where on the one hand, it's like, all right, here's these games where it's like single screen arcade, and then, oh, check it out, it's a game where the screen scrolls and there's secrets you can find. And it's like, maybe they didn't recognize that as being like a revolution that was about to happen, but you can see that starting to happen, which is, that's the kind of thing where we occasionally have people ask us, like, oh, you should have AI summarize your magazines for you and give, like, insights or whatever. And we're not doing that. But also, that's the kind of thing you only get by understanding the context. Like, if you're studying the industry and you understand what computer games were before, and you see these things juxtaposed, you can see, like, okay, you can see this narrative starting of, this is what's innovative about this next wave of console that's going to stick more than something like Rob or Duck Hunt necessarily.
Well, and I think that sort of context around it is what makes this important, as in the availability of Computer Entertainer, because we were talking earlier about how there's not a lot of resources, and yes, I can name some. You know what I mean? Like, I can probably, if I search hard enough, I could probably find a newspaper column that talked about Super Mario Brothers when it was new-ish, right? Like you could find these sort of like bits and pieces here and there. But Computer Entertainer is a publication that has a specific perspective on the world that is persistent throughout this transitional period, and there's nothing else like that. Like, Phil was mentioning that, Computer Gaming World was around, and indeed, Computer Gaming World will come back from CES and say Nintendo's launching a system, and they might even list a couple games, right? There's magazines like Analog and Antic covering like Atari computers, kind of doing the same thing. They'll be like, Nintendo's around, they're doing this, but there isn't something that is, I mean, we're seeing it on this page here, right? Like that has perspectives talking about video games that you can see talking about other games and other systems at the same time, and it really gives you a context for how this stuff fit into the larger picture.
Yeah, there's an earlier issue where they cover the first rumor of, hey, there's a rumor Nintendo is going to bring their game system to the US. And it's not just like, like a blind item news thing. They say like, hey, Nintendo's considering launching a console in the US. Boy, this does not seem like a good idea. Here's what's happening. The market's really struggling right now. This seems really risky. And it's like, they're doing that because they are covering the dregs of all these other systems dying. Like, in a similar article, I think they went to a trade show and it was like, here's the new games coming out for Atari, and they give them all like 1 star, and they're like, don't bother, like, this is crap. And so, like, they were familiar with what was happening in that space because they were covering it. So I think, it is, in total, collectively, they have such a unique perspective that it's really exciting to capture that.
I think like a really good example of that is just on the next page 13 of this issue. The very first news article there is titled "Third Party for Nintendo," and says, "In what can only be good news for those who own or intend to buy the Nintendo Entertainment System, we have independent confirmation from several sources that third-party software for the system is already in the works and likely to be made available this year." Third-party software is just a given for any game console now, but this was a space where, like you're saying, because of context around other, game consoles, the decline of video game sales in America, this wasn't something that was obvious to people. This was something that people had to kind of take into consideration.
They go on to spell out, and they're going to license the third-party software, which means there's not going to be a glut of bargain bin knockoff nonsense. There's going to be quality control, and that's good. And on the opposite column is a reader reaction, and it's a reader mail of someone who's like, yeah, I canceled my pre-order for Atari 7800 because it was supposed to ship 2.5 months ago, and it hasn't, and they're telling me a bunch of nonsense, and they've talked about the conflicting rumors about whether or not it's even shipped yet. And
I gotta read the sentence in there. It says, the bizarre fanatical secrecy surrounding their plans for the 7800 also leaves me suspicious.
Whew. Dang. Love reader mail. Nothing like the video game magazine letters. The bombast. That this is the same in the 90s and the same in the 2000s. We run into it all the time.
I really want, if James Cooper of Stores Connecticut listens to FunFactor, please let me know if you bought an Atari 7800, because I bet you did. I bet you cooled down and bought one.
Something's jumping out at me here. The third party thing was a big deal. And the security chip, they're calling out the security chip. And that is something that the more I'm digging into the NES around its launch, the more I realize what a big deal that was to everyone. That is something that when Nintendo's meeting with retailers explaining we're introducing a video game system, part of their sales pitch is we have a security system that locks people out from putting crap games on our system. That is a core function of the NES. It's something that Nintendo has said that was a requirement for this to even work in the US. And the fact that Computer Entertainer's talking about it, well, it tells me that Nintendo's kind of feeding them that. I don't think they kind of came up with that on their own, but that was a huge initiative for them. And then I also just kind of want to correct myself from earlier. So we are in June of that year. I think that is when it's starting to go national. And if you look at the second article here, New Way to Buy Nintendo System, bottom of page 13, it is spelling out that the control deck, this is a newly available SKU, and it comes with Super Mario Brothers. So we are in a time when Nintendo is kind of starting to push Super Mario Brothers. So,
yes.
not to disparage their opinion of it as being a hot game, right? But to Nintendo's credit, they've sort of seen the light at this point, and they're like, oh, this is our star. Let's put him front and center.
What do we think, Ty? What do you give Computer Entertainer's review of Super Mario Brothers?
Yeah, well, we have a screenshot, probably good 300-400 words. We've got a really authentic perspective as a gamer, and it highlights what the game does well. It doesn't give it a full score for graphics, compared to soccer. But Mario Brothers had some cool stuff going on graphically, but it wasn't as breathtaking, artistically as the NES could get necessarily. So I see a lot to like here. I think I'm going to give it 9 warp whistles out of 10.
9 warp whistles out of 10. What about you, Frank? What are you going to give? You're biased. You can give it a perfect review score if you want, but what do you think?
Yeah, I'm looking at this as, does this tell us anything new about the past? That's kind of all I care about. And I think it does a really tremendous job of that. I think it demonstrates to us that this is something that people quickly understood was special. I think it does a great job of illustrating why they think that it's special. Given the word supper is used, it's 300 out of 200 mushrooms.
Cool.
Bill, you're up. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good fair review. I think looking back at it, I think they do make a big deal about that it's a good game, but we don't see as much in terms of the sort of momentousness that I think people would associate with a review like this. So looking at it in hindsight, as someone trying to predict the future, I'm going to give it 3 Cassandras out of 5.
3 Cassandras out of 5.
Okay.
I really like the word Frank for my score. I really like the word Frank used earlier, which was intuitive. You could tell that they felt and knew that this was something special. I'm going to give it a solid 3.5 graphics diamonds out of 4 gameplay diamonds. It's a good one. It should have just been longer. I would have liked to have seen them,
Sure.
give it a full half page or something like that. So I knock it down just for not quite being as long as it could have been. But yeah, it's very good. I was quite impressed when I sat down to read this, and I was like, oh, okay, they actually really knew what they had with this game.
Yeah, I think they did. I like that it closes on no owner of the Nintendo Entertainment System should be without this game, and Nintendo went, you know what, you're right. We'll
right.
ship it in the
That's
box
right.
with the system.
Now they should really include this with like Duck Hunt and Track and Field and make sure people can get a sampling of what's available on this system.
Yeah, great idea. Oh, man.
Phil, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today. This is fascinating. I could have done a 7-hour episode about this. We'd love to have you on again in the future to continue to talk about games preservation, games history, the work you're doing at the Video Game History Foundation. Can you tell us where can we find you? Where can we find Computer Entertainer? And where can we find a copy of Dick Francis High Stakes for the IBM PC?
I believe that Video Takeout might sell. I'm not going to attempt to recall the name of the whatever you just said, but in general, the foundation is super easy. Gamehistory.org, and Computer Entertainer specifically, the sort of hub for that would be gamehistory.org/Computer Entertainer, one word.
What about you, Phil? Where can we find you?
I'm usually hanging out on Blue Sky. I'm Phil Salv on Blue Sky, just the default at bsky.social. I occasionally stream at twitch.tv/obscuratory, playing unusual old things. Probably not going to play Dick Francis High Stakes, because I don't, Video Takeout's not been responding to my letters, unfortunately.
Well, did we get it right? Did this bonus episode of FunFactor entertain your computer or brain? Leave a review of our reviews at Apple Podcasts. Post it as a comment on YouTube. We will read the best ones on air. And hey, go ahead and pass this show around to all your friends like it's 3rd grade and we're on the playground. Shout us out on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at FunFactorPod. Special thanks to Millennium Falck for all our amazing original music. Check out his work and his awesome Windows 95 styled website at millenniumfalck.com. Unlike these old magazines, you won't have to wait a whole month for your next installment. We drop new episodes every 2 weeks. So go to funfactorpod.com to follow our show on your podcatcher of choice, and please consider becoming a member of FunFactor Ultra, our premium tiers that unlock ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and the swanky members-only channels of our Discord. Just go to funfactorpod.com, sign up, promise you cannot miss the widget. If you do, you and we will have a maximum score in FunFactor.
Okay, we just got to record something real quick. I forgot to give outros to you guys. And
Yeah.
Signal boost. $3, which in 2015 terms is
Why
is kinda
2015?
high. I wonder what that would look like.
It's
Yeah, what that would look
2025
like.
now.
Oh my gosh, it's 2025. Jesus Christ. That's even more. $3 is even more with today's inflation.
Aiden is just learning the year at this moment.
Where have I been? Is this a PlayStation 5 out yet? Is it good? You got anything, Ty? We should probably wrap up.
That's what I was thinking. We're getting right to the end, and as much as I hate to cut this because we could literally go through probably every page of every issue of this magazine and go, this is cool, this reminds me of this, that is cool, that reminds me of that.
I just went to their listing of availabilities. I see there's a game they're selling for Apple II called Margaritaville, and I really want to know if that's based on a song.
It must be. Where was that released even? Oh my gosh. Jimmy Buffett and his fast casual dining chain will come back
just
from
above
the
that is a
grave.
game called Consultant, which sounds thrilling.
Amazing. One last thing in the soccer, it was funny, they pointed out, because I only skimmed it and then I went back and reread at one point, and they noted that you can't cross in a header, and they were like, oh, like we like seeing Pele do that. They described it as kicking the ball to your teammate, who then catches it with his head, with catch and scare quotes, and I'm like, okay, that's one way to describe what's happening. But in 1986, if you were not into soccer, so that's that was outstanding to me.
Yeah. I would usually catch a soccer ball in the face when I would try to head it because I'm not very athletic. So that feels apt for me.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it, everyone. Our pleasure. Bye.
Bye, all. Hey, Ty, can we stick around just for a sec?
Sure.
I just forgot to hit record when we were doing our cold open.
Oh, okay.
I could just record my lines right now if you want, but it's probably just easier to do it as a chunk.
Do a second take. Yeah.
Okay.